There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or a shared pizza, or a movie you've both seen a dozen times. You don't recognize them as watershed moments when they're happening. There is no thunderclap, no dramatic swell of music. There is only a quiet shift in the atmosphere, a change in the pressure of the air in the room, so subtle that you might miss it entirely if you weren't paying attention. But I was always paying attention, especially when it came to him. My life, as I knew it, had been a series of carefully constructed rooms, each with a specific purpose and sturdy, well-defined walls. There was the room for my photography, a dark space filled with the scent of chemicals and the ghost of images waiting to be born. There was the room for my quiet, solitary life, ordered and predictable. And then there was the room for Julian. That room was brighter than the others, filled with the sound of his laughter and the comfortable, easy cadence of our friendship. For years, the door to that room had been the most important threshold in my life, a boundary I policed with silent, vigilant care. I knew what was on my side of the door, and I thought I knew what was on his. It was a friendship, deep and true, but a friendship nonetheless. The moment that changed everything, the moment the foundations of that room began to tremble, was cloaked in the simple, mundane complaint of being cold. We were at his apartment, a sprawling, minimalist space on the 17th floor that always felt a little too big for one person, especially now. The city glittered below us, a silent, indifferent galaxy of light, and the movie we were pretending to watch cast flickering blue shadows across the walls. It was late autumn, and the old building's heating was temperamental, a groaning, unpredictable beast. A draft snaked its way in from the massive single-pane window, and I shivered, pulling the thin throw blanket tighter around my shoulders. It was a reflexive, thoughtless gesture, but he noticed. Julian always noticed things like that, small fissures in the composure of the people around him. He paused the movie, the sudden silence amplifying the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sigh of traffic. His face, illuminated by the frozen image on the screen, was a study in soft angles and concern. For a long moment, he just looked at me, his gaze analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex problem. The air thickened, charged with a meaning I couldn't yet decipher. It was the kind of silence we had shared 1,000 times before, comfortable and deep, but this time it felt different. It felt like the held breath before a plunge. "You're still cold," he stated. It wasn't a question. I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight. I watched as he shifted on the large leather couch, a fluid movement that was a relic from his college athlete days. He unfolded his long legs and then gestured to the space he had just created, a warm hollow between his outstretched limbs, his back resting against the arm of the sofa. It was an invitation, but one so audacious, so far beyond the established blueprint of our friendship, that my mind struggled to process it. It was a door opening into a room I never knew existed. My heart began a frantic, panic drumming against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. This was not in the schematics. This was a deviation, a dangerous, beautiful, terrifying anomaly. I could feel the heat radiating from him, a tangible promise of warmth that was more than just physical. It was the warmth of his presence, the steady, grounding energy that had been a constant in my life for almost a decade. And then he pulled me, not roughly, but with a gentle, insistent pressure on my arm. He guided me from my lonely corner of the couch into that space, arranging me so my back was flush against his chest, my head tucked just beneath his chin. The thin blanket came with me, a flimsy, useless barrier between us. He wrapped his arms around me, his hands resting on my stomach, and the world simply fell away. The cold was gone, instantly replaced by an overwhelming, shocking wave of heat that seemed to sink directly into my bones. My entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing in a mixture of terror and a longing so profound it ached. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my shoulder blade, a rhythm that was both calming and electrifying. His breath stirred the hair at the nape of my neck. The scent of him, clean laundry, the faint, spicy notes of his soap, and something that was just uniquely Julian, filled my senses, short-circuiting my ability to think. He leaned his chin on the top of my head, a gesture of such casual, profound intimacy that it stole the air from my lungs. A low, soft rumble vibrated through his chest, and into my back as he spoke, his voice a quiet whisper meant only for me. Better. And in that single word, in that one quiet question, the entire architecture of my world was demolished and rebuilt into something new, something fragile and unknown. I couldn't speak. I could only manage a small, jerky nod, pressing myself infinitesimally closer into the impossible safety of his embrace. Better, I thought. Yes, and so much worse. Because I knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating, that I would never be able to go back to the way things were before. The door had been thrown open, and I was standing on the threshold of a place from which there was no return. It hadn't always been like this tightrope walk of unspoken things. For 8 years, our friendship had been the most stable structure in my life. I met Julian during my sophomore year of college. I was the quiet art student, the one who lived behind the lens of a camera, cataloging the world in frames of light and shadow. My camera was both a tool and a shield, allowing me to be present in the world, but also one step removed from it, an observer by nature and by choice. He was, in every conceivable way, my opposite. Julian was a force of nature, a campus celebrity who seemed to move through the world with an effortless, sun-drenched confidence. He was the star forward on the basketball team, a business major with a quick laugh and a gravitational pull that drew people into his orbit. He was bright, loud, and incandescently alive. I was content to be a satellite, watching him from a safe and silent distance. Our worlds collided in the most mundane of settings, a required literature seminar we were both putting off until the last possible semester. I sat in the back, as always, taking notes and sketching faces in the margins of my notebook. He sat in the front, actively engaging with the professor, his hand always the first to shoot up. He wasn't just coasting on his athletic scholarship. He was genuinely curious, genuinely engaged. It was the first thing that surprised me about him. I had made assumptions, boxing him into the archetype of the popular jock. But Julian was more complex than that, a layered composition I found myself wanting to study more closely. One afternoon, after class, he caught me as I was packing up my camera bag. He'd seen me taking photos around campus, he said, and he just wanted to tell me he thought my work was incredible. He'd seen a few of my pieces in the student art show, black and white portraits that focused on capturing the quiet, unguarded moments of strangers. He spoke about them with an unexpected eloquence, describing the way I'd captured the light, the emotion in a subject's eyes. He saw what I was trying to do. He understood the language I was speaking with my camera. That was the beginning. We started talking after class, our conversations spilling out of the lecture hall and into the campus coffee shop. I learned that the confident athlete was also a voracious reader who loved old science fiction novels. He learned that the quiet photographer had a dry, observational wit that only surfaced when he felt comfortable. We were an unlikely pair, a study in contrasts, but we fit together in a way that defied logic. He drew me out of my shell, and I, in turn, offered him a space where he didn't have to perform. With me, he wasn't the star athlete or the campus big shot. He was just Julian. Our friendship was built in those early days, a foundation of shared coffee, late-night study sessions, and conversations that lasted for hours. It was easy. It was safe. He had a long-term girlfriend, Sarah, a kind and intelligent woman who was as much a part of his life as basketball. I was his friend, the platonic confidant, the brother he never had. It was a role I accepted, a box I willingly put myself in, because the alternative was unthinkable. The truth, the secret I kept locked away in the most fortified room of my heart, was that I had started falling for him almost immediately. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic plunge, but a slow, gradual erosion, like water wearing away stone. It was in the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he genuinely smiled. It was in the focused intensity he brought to everything, whether it was a basketball game or a debate about a novel. It was in the casual, unconscious way he would drape an arm over my shoulder when we were walking, a gesture of easy affection that meant everything to me and nothing to him. I loved him. It was a simple, terrifying, and immutable fact of my existence. But I was a master of self-preservation. I took that love and I buried it deep, building layers of friendship and plausible deniability over it until it was almost invisible, even to me. I became an expert at interpreting the nuance of our relationship, at understanding the precise boundaries. I knew the exact duration a hug could last before it crossed from friendly to something more. I knew the conversational topics that were safe and the ones that skirted too close to the dangerous territory of real intimacy. My friendship with Julian was the most precious thing I had, and I would have done anything to protect it. Risking it for a feeling he could never return was a gamble I was not willing to take. So I watched from the sidelines of his life. I was there for the championship wins and the devastating losses. I was there when he and Sarah fought, and I was there when they made up. I was the best man at their hypothetical wedding we joked about, the godfather to their imaginary children. I photographed their life together, creating a beautiful archive of a love that wasn't mine. Each click of the shutter was a small, silent act of devotion and a small, silent heartbreak. I learned to live with the quiet ache in my chest, the low-grade hum of unrequited love. It became a part of me, like the faint scent of developer that always clung to my clothes. The years passed. We graduated. I pursued photography, slowly building a career out of my passion, finding success in capturing the soul of buildings and landscapes. Julian, after a knee injury ended any hope of a professional sports career, poured his relentless energy into the world of tech, becoming a successful software consultant. He and Sarah moved in together. Our friendship remained the one constant, a sturdy bridge connecting our separate adult lives. We still had our weekly dinners, our movie nights, our long phone calls. The architecture of our bond felt permanent, built to withstand anything. I had made my peace with the shape of it, with the room I was allowed to occupy in his life. I had convinced myself it was enough. The first tremor that shook that foundation came on a rainy Tuesday in October. My phone rang just after midnight. It was Julian, his voice thick and broken in a way I had never heard before. He didn't even say hello. "It's over," he choked out. "Leo, she's gone." Sarah had left him. It was sudden, a clean break that he hadn't seen coming. She had felt, for a long time, that they were on different paths, that the love they had built in college hadn't translated into the adult world they now inhabited. She had packed her bags while he was on a business trip and left a letter on the kitchen counter. My heart broke for him, a clean, sharp pain that was entirely separate from the complicated mess of my own feelings. This was my friend, my best friend, and he was in agony. I told him to stay put, that I was coming over. I drove through the slick, empty streets, my mind racing. I was preparing myself to be the friend he needed, the listener, the shoulder to cry on, the person who would sit with him in the wreckage and say nothing at all. I was slipping back into my designated role, the one I knew how to play. When I let myself into his apartment, the silence was the first thing that hit me. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, a stark contrast to the usual warmth and life that filled the space. Julian was sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, surrounded by half-empty packing boxes from their recent move. He was just staring at the letter in his hand, his face pale and hollowed out in the dim light. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, the vibrant energy that always surrounded him completely extinguished. I sat down on the floor across from him, not saying a word, just being there. For hours, he talked. He cycled through confusion, anger, and a deep, gut-wrenching sorrow. He dissected their entire relationship, searching for the moment it had gone wrong, the sign he had missed. I listened, offering quiet affirmations, letting him pour out all the pain and bewilderment. I was the container for his grief, and I held it as carefully as I could. Sometime around 4 in the morning, his words finally ran out. He was utterly exhausted, emotionally and physically spent. His eyes were red-rimmed and glassy. He leaned his head back against the leg of the couch and closed his eyes. "I don't want to be alone tonight, Leo," he whispered, his voice raw. It was a plea, a confession of a vulnerability he rarely showed. My heart clenched. Of course, he didn't. I wasn't going anywhere. I told him to try and get some sleep, that I would take the couch. He just shook his head, a slow, tired motion. He didn't want to sleep in their bed, he said. Not yet. He asked if he could just stay here, on the floor. I looked at him, at the profound exhaustion etched onto his face, and my carefully constructed walls began to crumble. He looked like a lost child. I got up and pulled the cushions off the large sofa, arranging them on the floor to make a makeshift bed. I grabbed the thickest blanket I could find in the hall closet. I told him to lie down. He did, curling up on his side, his body tight with tension. I sat on the far end of the cushions, my back against the couch, planning to keep watch until he fell asleep. After a few minutes of tense silence, he shifted, rolling onto his back. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. He started, his voice cracking. I just feel so untethered. Like nothing's holding me down. The metaphor hung in the air between us, painfully apart. He had lost his anchor. Without thinking, without allowing my hyper-analytical brain to intervene, I reached out and laid my hand on his arm, over the fabric of his sweatshirt. It was meant to be a simple gesture of comfort, a physical punctuation to the words, "I'm here," but the moment my skin made contact with his, a current passed between us. I felt the rigid knot of tension in his bicep begin to soften just slightly under my palm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his head on the cushion and looked at me, his eyes dark and swimming with a desperate, unnamed need. It was more than just grief for Sarah. It was a deeper loneliness, a cavernous emptiness that her departure had exposed. He was adrift, and he was searching for something, anything, to hold on to. In that moment, I was it. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't have to. He just closed his eyes, and with my hand still resting on his arm, he finally, blessedly, fell asleep. I stayed like that for over an hour, a human anchor, terrified to move, terrified to breathe, feeling the weight of his trust and my own treacherous, burgeoning hope. That was the shift. It was the night the established rules were suspended, the night he began to reach for me not just as a friend, but as a source of physical comfort, a warmth against the encroaching cold of his new reality. In the weeks that followed, a new routine began to form, a ritual born of his need and my silent compliance. It started subtly. He'd call me after work, his voice still holding a fragile edge, and ask if I wanted to come over. The pretext was always something plausible. I ordered too much food, or there's a game on you'd like, or simply, I don't feel like being alone. I always said yes. I would arrive at his apartment to find him rattling around in the too large space, a ghost haunting the life he was supposed to have. The first few times, we maintained our usual distance. We'd sit on opposite ends of the enormous couch, a safe and respectable gulf of leather between us, and talk or watch something on TV. But the gravitational pull of his loneliness was immense. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, that gulf began to shrink. It would start with his foot brushing against mine. Then he would shift, leaning his head back on the cushions, his shoulder pressing lightly against my own. Each new point of contact was a minor earthquake in my carefully controlled world. My body would go on high alert, every nerve ending firing. I would analyze the pressure, the duration, the intent. Was it accidental? A thoughtless comfort-seeking gesture? Or was it something more? My mind became a frantic courtroom, arguing both sides of the case with equal fervor. The prosecutor insisted it was nothing, a simple byproduct of grief and proximity. The defense attorney, a hopeful, foolish romantic, dared to suggest it was a subconscious language, a way for him to ask for something he didn't know how to name. I was the judge, and I was perpetually deadlocked, unable to reach a verdict. I lived in a state of exquisite, agonizing suspense. The ritual solidified around movie nights. His apartment, with its vast wall of windows, was always cold in the evenings. This became the unspoken excuse, the foundational piece of plausible deniability upon which our new intimacy was built. He had blankets, of course, thick, expensive-looking wool throws, but they were never quite enough. One night, about a month after the breakup, I was huddled under one, shivering despite myself. It was that night, the night that replayed in my memory like a sacred, secret film. He had noticed my shiver. He'd paused the movie, and he had pulled me between his legs, wrapping me in the undeniable warmth of his own body. He'd asked if it was better, and my silent nod had been a form of consent, a quiet surrender. That night, a new clause was added to the unspoken contract of our friendship. This was now something we did. It became the centerpiece of our ritual. Every Friday, I would go to his place. We'd order takeout. We'd put on a movie, and at some point, either because of a real or imagined chill in the air, the migration would happen. I would move from my end of the couch to the space between his legs, and he would fold himself around me, his arms a secure cage, his chin a familiar weight on my head. My body learned the shape of his. I learned the exact cadence of his breathing as he started to relax, the way his chest would rise and fall against my back. I learned that he would often fall asleep before the movie was even halfway through, his grip on me slackening, his breathing deepening into a soft, vulnerable snore. In those moments, with him asleep and the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling, I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. It was a stolen peace, a borrowed intimacy, and I knew it was temporary. But I soaked in it anyway, like a man dying of thirst who had stumbled upon an oasis. I would stay perfectly still, my own exhaustion forgotten, my muscles aching from the stillness, just to prolong the moment, just to keep him anchored and safe for a little while longer. My camera, which had once been my primary way of seeing him, now felt inadequate. A photograph could capture the way the light fell on his face, but it couldn't capture the feeling of his heartbeat against my spine. It couldn't document the subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room when he reached for me. This new reality was something that could only be experienced, not recorded. It was a language of touch and proximity, of shared warmth and silent understanding. I was becoming fluent in it, even as I was terrified of what it all meant. I was living inside a dream I had never dared to have, and I was constantly waiting for the moment I would wake up. I would lie there, cocooned in his arms, my mind racing. I tried to find the logic in it. He was grieving. He was lonely. I was his best friend, his safe harbor in a storm. This was just an extension of that, a physical manifestation of the emotional support I was providing. It was a desperate, brotherly affection, magnified by trauma. I told myself these things over and over, a mantra to keep my own hope from spiraling out of control. But then there were the other moments, the small, seemingly insignificant details that my hopeful heart would seize upon. There was the way he would sometimes tighten his grip on me for no reason, pulling me even closer, as if he were afraid I might drift away. There was the time I had started to get up to use the restroom, and he had made a low, protesting noise in his sleep, his arms instinctively holding me in place. There was the morning I woke up on the couch, still tangled up with him, to find him already awake, just looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't sad, it wasn't grateful. It was something else, something deeper and more complex, a soft, questioning look that vanished the moment he realized I was awake, replaced by his usual easy smile. Each of these moments was a piece of evidence, a clue that I would turn over and over in my mind for days. I was a detective investigating the mystery of his heart, but I was also the primary suspect, too close to the case to be objective. The couch became our island, a self-contained world with its own rules and its own climate. Outside of that apartment, our friendship retained its old shape. We'd meet for lunch, talk on the phone, see mutual friends, and no one would have suspected a thing. The boundaries were firmly back in place. But we both knew that Friday night was coming, and with it, the dissolution of those boundaries, the return to our strange and sacred ritual of closeness. This duality was tearing me apart. I was living two lives, the life of the dependable friend and the secret life of the man who was held by the man he loved. The tension was becoming unbearable, a string pulled so taut it was humming with the threat of snapping. I knew something had to give. I just didn't know what. The breaking point arrived on a cold night in late winter, nearly 6 months after Sarah had left. The ritual had become so ingrained, so much a part of our weekly rhythm, that it no longer required a pretext. The chill in the air was a given, the movie a formality. I arrived at his apartment, and after our usual greeting, after we had unpacked the Thai food on his coffee table, I simply gravitated to my spot on the couch. He settled in behind me a moment later, folding around me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But tonight, something was different. The usual comforting weight of him felt heavier, charged with a nervous energy I hadn't felt before. He wasn't relaxing. His arms were tense around me, his heartbeat a little too fast against my back. We didn't turn on a movie. We sat in the near darkness, the only light coming from the sprawling cityscape beyond the window. The silence stretched, no longer comfortable, but thick with unspoken questions. I could feel him thinking, his mind working furiously behind me. I stayed perfectly still, my own heart beginning to hammer in my chest, sensing that the delicate equilibrium we had maintained for so long was about to shatter. I braced myself, unsure of what was coming, but knowing, with a deep, instinctual certainty, that this was it. This was the end of the ritual, one way or another. He shifted, And for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to pull away, to end it, to finally erect a permanent wall between us. My entire body tensed in anticipation of the loss. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he adjusted his position, his hand moving from my stomach to my shoulder. With his other hand, he gently took my chin and turned my head, so that I had to look back at him. His face was only inches from mine. In the dim, reflected light from the city, his eyes were dark pools of sincerity and a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The easygoing mask he usually wore was gone. In its place was the same desperate, questioning look I had seen that one morning, but this time it wasn't fleeting. It was steady, and it was directed right at me. He searched my face, his gaze moving from my eyes to my mouth and back again. The air crackled between us. The entire world seemed to shrink down to this single point, this tiny space between our faces. I forgot how to breathe. This was the moment I had simultaneously dreamed of and dreaded for nearly a decade. It was here. It was real. And I was completely, utterly terrified. I was afraid to hope, but it was too late. Hope was a flood, washing away all my carefully constructed defenses. His thumb stroked my jaw, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through my entire body. His own breath was unsteady. He swallowed, the sound loud in the silent room. And then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, a fragile, breakable thing. Leo. He breathed my name like a prayer. Would it be okay? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was asking. He was asking for permission to cross the final, most sacred boundary. He was asking if he could detonate the world we knew and build a new one from the rubble. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me the power to say no, to retreat to the safety of our old friendship, to pretend this moment had never happened. I could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of rejection, the fear of what this would mean. And in that fear, I saw the truth. This wasn't just about comfort anymore. This wasn't about grief or loneliness. This was about me. It had become about me. All the evidence I had been collecting, all the secret hopes I had harbored, they all coalesced in this one, terrifying, beautiful moment of truth. My voice, when I finally found it, was as shaky as his. Yes, I whispered. It was the single most courageous word I had ever spoken. It was the demolition of every wall I had ever built. It was a leap of faith into an unknown abyss. He closed his eyes for a second, a brief flicker of relief and resolve passing over his features. And then, slowly, tentatively, as if he were handling something infinitely precious and breakable, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss like in the movies. It was soft. It was hesitant. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It was the taste of salt and fear and a profound, earth-shattering relief. It was the feeling of a door, locked for a lifetime, finally clicking open. I met his tentative pressure with my own, a silent answer to his unspoken question. My hand came up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, wild beating of his heart, a perfect match for my own. The kiss deepened, but it never lost its gentleness, its sense of discovery. It was a conversation without words, a mapping of new territory. It was the end of the long, cold winter and the first, hesitant promise of spring. In that moment, held securely in his arms, with the city lights blurring into a watercolor wash through the tears I hadn't realized were falling, I wasn't just warm. I was home. The morning after was a study in silence and glaring, uncomfortable light. I woke up alone on the couch, the indentation where his body had been next to mine already growing cold. The sun streamed in through the large window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the profound emptiness of the room. He was gone, not just from the couch, but from the apartment. A single coffee mug sat on the counter, a sign he had been up and out before I had even stirred. My heart, which had felt so full and certain just hours before, began to shrink, a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. I had been so sure. The kiss had felt like a destination, a final arrival. But the silence, the emptiness, the sheer absence of him felt like a brutal, swift departure. I sat up, my body aching, my mind a chaotic swirl of confusion and rising panic. Had I imagined it all? Had I misinterpreted the gentleness, the vulnerability, the whispered question? My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a sharp, jarring sound in the quiet apartment. It was a text from him. My hand trembled as I reached for it. A part of me desperate to read it, and another part wanting to throw the phone against the wall. Hey, I'm so sorry about last night. I was a mess. That was out of line. Can we just forget it happened? Each word was a physical blow. A mess. Out of line. Forget it happened. He was framing it as a mistake, a moment of weakness born from his lingering grief and my convenient presence. He was trying to put the lid back on Pandora's box, to shove all the chaos and beauty and truth we had uncorked back inside and pretend it never existed. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest withered and died, replaced by a sharp, bitter wave of hurt. It was followed by a slow, simmering anger. I wasn't his emotional support animal. I wasn't a temporary bandage for his broken heart. I was a person, and what had happened between us had been real. It had meant something to me, and his casual, terrified dismissal of it felt like a profound betrayal. It was worse than a simple rejection. It was an invalidation of the entire emotional landscape we had been navigating for months. He was scared. I could understand that. But his fear was bulldozing my heart. I didn't reply to the text. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? No, we can't forget it happened, because it was the most real moment of my life. Or, it's okay, I understand, which would be a lie that would poison whatever was left of our friendship. So I said nothing. I gathered my things, let myself out of his apartment, and walked out into the cold, bright morning. The city felt hostile, the sunlight too harsh. I went home to my own quiet space, which now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison cell. The silence in my apartment was different from the silence in his. His was an absence. Mine was a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket of loneliness and frustration. For the next week, we existed in a state of suspended animation. He didn't call. I didn't text. The thread of our constant communication, a lifeline I had taken for granted for 8 years, was severed. The silence was an active, malevolent thing, growing larger and more intimidating with each passing day. It was a chasm opening up between us, and I watched, paralyzed, as the distance grew. I replayed the kiss, the months leading up to it, every conversation, every touch, searching for where I had gone wrong. Had I been a willing participant in my own delusion? Had I projected my own feelings onto his actions, seeing what I wanted to see? His text message certainly suggested so. But my heart, my intuition, the memory of the look in his eyes just before he'd kissed me, it all screamed a different story. He hadn't been using me. He had been as lost in that moment as I was. He was just a coward. The anger gave way to a deep, profound sadness. I mourned the loss of what we almost had, and I mourned the potential loss of the friendship that had been the bedrock of my adult life. I had known this was a risk. I had policed that boundary for years for this very reason. I had let him cross it, had even walked across it with him, and now it seemed we were both lost in a no-man's land, unable to go forward and unwilling to go back. The Friday of that week came and went. My phone remained silent. I imagined him in his apartment, alone and just as miserable as I was. Or maybe he was relieved. Maybe the distance was exactly what he wanted. The not knowing was the worst part. It was a torture of ambiguity far more painful than the sweet tension we had shared on the couch. After 9 days of radio silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't live in this limbo. I needed an answer, even if it was the one I didn't want to hear. I needed to look him in the eye and make him say it. If our friendship was over, if what happened was a mistake he truly regretted, then he owed me the decency of telling me to my face. I needed to replace the agonizing question mark with a definitive period, no matter how painful. So, on a Sunday afternoon, I put on my coat, my hands shaking with a mixture of resolve and dread, and I drove to his apartment. I was done being the passive observer. For the first time, I was going to force the issue. I was going to demand the truth. I used my key to let myself in, a privilege he had given me years ago that now felt like a transgression. He was there, standing in the kitchen, staring into an empty coffee pot, as if it held the answers to the universe. He hadn't heard me come in. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on for 3 days. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his entire posture was slumped in defeat. He looked just as lost and broken as he had the night Sarah left, maybe even more so. The sight of him, so utterly wrecked, momentarily softened my anger, but my resolve held. He finally sensed my presence and turned, his eyes widening in surprise and then clouding over with guilt and fear. "Leo," he said, his voice raspy. "Don't," I said, holding up a hand, my own voice sharper than I intended. "Don't you dare say you're sorry. Not like you did in the text." I walked further into the room, closing the distance between us until I was standing just a few feet away. I needed him to see that I wasn't going to let him hide. "I've spent the last 9 days driving myself insane, Julian, trying to figure out what happened. And I'm done. I'm done guessing." He wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked down at the floor, at the counter, anywhere but at me. "It was a mistake," he mumbled, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "Was it?" I challenged, my voice rising. "Was it a mistake when you pulled me onto the couch that first time? Was it a mistake every single Friday night for the last 4 months? Was it a mistake when you asked me if it was okay? Because it didn't feel like a mistake to me, Julian. It felt like the truest thing that has ever happened between us." A tear slid down his cheek, then another. He still wouldn't look at me, but his shoulders started to shake. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Then make me understand." I was almost shouting now, the frustration and hurt of the last week pouring out of me. "Talk to me. For God's sake, just be honest with me. What are you so afraid of? Losing our friendship? It's a little late for that, don't you think? We're already losing it. It's dying in this miserable, pathetic silence. So what is it? Tell me what you were feeling that night. Or tell me you felt nothing. But look at me and tell me the truth." That finally did it. He lifted his head, and his face was a mess of conflicting emotions, grief, fear, and something that looked devastatingly like love. "I can't," he cried, his voice breaking completely. "I can't tell you I felt nothing, because I felt everything. And it terrifies me, Leo. It terrifies me because I don't know what it is. I've spent my whole life on a set path. College, basketball, Sarah, the job, it was all laid out. And then she left, and the path disappeared. And you were just there. You were my friend. You were my only solid ground. And then it all got complicated. And I liked it. God, I liked it so much. Being with you, holding you, it was the only time I felt okay. The only time I felt home." He finally collapsed, leaning his hands on the counter, his head bowed. He was sobbing now, deep, ragged breaths. "And that night," he continued, his voice muffled, "when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. It was the only thing I wanted to do. But the next morning, I woke up and I was so scared. Scared of what it meant. Scared of what I was feeling. Scared of what you would think of me. Scared of myself. It was easier to call it a mistake than to face what it really was." He finally looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "I'm sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I'm just so lost." The anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a coward, not really. He was just a man whose entire map of the world had been burned, and he was terrified of the new landscape he found himself in. He hadn't been invalidating my feelings. He had been running from the intensity of his own. I closed the remaining distance between us and wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into a hug. He crumpled against me, burying his face in my shoulder, and for the first time, it was me holding him, me providing the anchor. We stood there in the middle of his kitchen for a long time, the silence no longer a chasm but a space for healing. The truth was finally out, messy and complicated and terrifying, but it was out, and now we could finally begin to figure out what to do with it. The confession hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. It didn't solve everything, but it cleared away the fog of misunderstanding and fear that had settled over us. In its place was a raw, vulnerable honesty. We stood in his kitchen, me holding him as his sobs slowly subsided into shuddering breaths. There were no easy answers, no immediate declarations of love. There was only the quiet, profound relief of no longer being alone in the confusion. He eventually pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, looking exhausted but clearer than he had in weeks. The confrontation had been the storm we needed to clear the air. Now, in the quiet aftermath, we could finally begin to rebuild. "I don't know what this is," he said softly, his gaze finally steady on mine. "I don't know what I'm doing, Leo." "I know," I replied, my voice gentle. "That's okay. Me neither." And for the first time, that felt true. For years, I had been so certain of my feelings, so sure of the shape of my love for him. But this shared space of fear and possibility, was new territory for me too. My love had always been a solitary thing. Now, it was a dialogue. We don't have to know right now. I continued, my thumb brushing away a stray tear on his cheek. We just have to stop running from it. We have to talk. And so we did. We moved from the cold kitchen to the infamous couch, but we sat facing each other this time, our knees almost touching. We talked for hours, not as a grieving man and his supportive friend, but as two people trying to navigate the wreckage of what they were and the fragile beginnings of what they might become. He talked about the pressure he'd always felt to follow a certain script, to be the person everyone expected him to be. He admitted that his relationship with Sarah, towards the end, had been more about comfort and familiarity than passion. He talked about the profound loneliness he'd felt even before she left, a sense of being disconnected from his own life. He confessed that turning to me for comfort had started as an instinct, but had quickly become a need, a craving for a closeness that felt more real and grounding than anything he had ever known. I, in turn, began to dismantle my own fortress. I told him, hesitantly at first, and then with growing confidence, about the room in my heart I had reserved for him for 8 years. I told him about the quiet ache, the secret I had guarded so fiercely. I didn't tell him to make him feel guilty, but to make him understand that what he was feeling wasn't a sudden, confusing anomaly. It was a response to something that had been there all along, a silent current running beneath the surface of our friendship. As I spoke, I watched a series of emotions cross his face: surprise, regret, and finally, a deep, dawning understanding. He wasn't just stumbling into new feelings in a vacuum. He was stepping into a space that I had been holding for him all this time. That conversation was the new foundation. It was built not on plausible deniability and unspoken rituals, but on acknowledged fear and shared vulnerability. We decided not to put a label on it, not yet. The pressure of a defined relationship was too much for either of us. Instead, we agreed to simply be. To be in this new space together, honestly and intentionally. We agreed to replace the ambiguity with communication. No more guessing, no more running. If one of us was scared, we would say it. If one of us was unsure, we would ask. It was a simple promise, but it felt monumental. In the days and weeks that followed, a new normal began to emerge, a quiet, tender domesticity that felt both thrillingly new and deeply familiar. The couch ritual returned, but it was different. There was no pretext of being cold. I would come over, and he would open his arms, and I would settle against his chest. And it was a deliberate act of affection, a choice we were both making. Sometimes we would talk, our voices low in the dark. Other times we would just lie there in comfortable silence, his hand stroking my hair, my hand resting over his heart. The anxiety that had once hummed beneath the surface of my skin was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I was no longer a detective searching for clues. I was simply a man being held by the person he loved, who was, in his own tentative and stumbling way, learning to love him back. We started building a new architecture for our life together, one that blended his space and mine. He started leaving a toothbrush for me at his apartment. I cleared a drawer for him in my dresser for the nights he would stay over, exhausted after a long week, and just want the quiet of my smaller, cozier place. We cooked together, the easy, collaborative rhythm of it a metaphor for what we were becoming. The grand, romantic gestures you see in movies were absent. Our love story was being written in the small, mundane moments. In the way he'd bring me coffee in the morning exactly how I liked it. In the way I'd know he was stressed just by the tension in his shoulders and would start rubbing them without a word. It was a love built of understood silences, of intuitive gestures, of finding a home not in a place, but in a person. One evening, months later, we were lying on the couch in our usual configuration. A soft rain was pattering against the window, a soothing, gentle sound. The movie we had put on was long over, the screen dark. He was tracing patterns on my arm, his touch light and thoughtful. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble against my back. "I don't think I ever really knew what it felt like to be taken care of. Not really. I was always the one who was supposed to be strong, you know? The athlete, the provider, the one with the plan." He paused, and I felt him press a soft kiss to the top of my head. "You were the first person who ever made me feel like it was okay to just fall apart. You made a space for me to be a mess. And then you stayed." His words were simple, but they landed in my heart with the weight of a profound truth. All those years I had thought of myself as the quiet observer, the satellite in his orbit. I had been wrong. I hadn't just been watching. I had been creating a space. I had been building a sanctuary for him without even realizing it, a place where he could be his truest, most vulnerable self. And he, in turn, had finally found his way inside. I turned in his arms then, shifting so I could face him. I looked at his face, so familiar and yet so new in this context, and the love I felt for him was so overwhelming it felt like it might spill out of me. There was no more fear, no more uncertainty. There was just him. I leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that was no longer tentative or questioning, but sure and deep and full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. It was a kiss that said, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." We found our way, not by following a map, but by learning to navigate by the light of our own shared feelings. The grand, dramatic moments are not what define a life, I've learned. It is the accumulation of the small, quiet ones. It is the ordinary Tuesday nights, the shared warmth against a phantom chill, the whispered question that changes everything. Our story wasn't a sudden fire. It was a slow, gentle sunrise we had the patience to wait for. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, in the safe harbor of each other's arms, we found something far better than a well-defined room or a predictable path. We found a home.